Good morning. Today we're going to look at Psalm 22. This is a psalm of lament. It's really a psalm for the martyr, really. It's about an innocent sufferer who's being tortured for his faith, really, and because, really, for righteousness' sake, being tortured because he trusts in God. And we notice here in verse 1, this statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? And automatically, many of us will say, wait a minute, I've heard that before. That's right. I mean, that's exactly what Jesus said as he was dying on the cross. And the other interesting thing about that is the Jews did not identify psalms by number. They identified them by saying the first sentence of the psalm. And so Jesus is not only saying, speaking out of the torment of his soul as he's suffering the wrath of God to pay for our sins, but he is also effectively saying, look at Psalm 22. He is the ideal sufferer. And remarkably, this poetic psalm is fulfilled in great detail in his death by crucifixion. And it's written 1,000 years before Christ, more than 400 years before crucifixion was even invented. And yet we see these incredible details of what happens when people are crucified, and we see it played out in the story on the cross. It's interesting because Revelation 1:5, Jesus is called the faithful witness. And the word for witness there is the same word for martyr. Jesus really is the ideal martyr. He is the ideal righteous martyr. And yet this psalm was written for all the martyrs in many ways as well, and yet it was ideally fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. But we see this even before Christ. Many were suffered and tormented and tortured for their faith. Certainly a number of the prophets, but also during the Maccabean revolt, there were many Jewish believers horribly persecuted for their faith and tortured to death. And but let's look at this through the eyes of the story of the cross. Verse 7 and 8. He is despised and mocked for his trust in God, which certainly happened to many martyrs when they're tortured for their faith. But it happened to Jesus as well, didn't it? Verses 12 to 13, his enemies are described like a roaring lion. Peter likens Satan to a roaring lion. I mean, this is satanic in its opposition and its evil. Verse 14, his bones are out of joint. This would commonly happen to people when they were crucified. By the weight and exhaustion of their body, they literally would their arms would be pulled out of their sockets. I mean, when people were put on the rack during the Inquisition, their bones were pulled out of socket, pulled out of joint oftentimes. Verse 15, his heart melts like wax. Jesus' heart, when it was pierced, we see blood and water coming out, which can happen when the heart is under intense stress. The water separates in the pericardium there. In verses 16 through 17, dogs encompass me. Dogs was a derogatory term for Gentiles. Who was crucifying Jesus? It was the Gentile Romans crucifying him. And they pierced his hands and his feet. Precisely what happens when a person is crucified. Verse 18, they divide his garments and they cast lots for them. The Romans did exactly this thing. This is what the Roman soldiers did. The righteous sufferer has all his worldly goods taken from him, even his clothes stripped from him. Jesus had this literally happen to him. We see in verse 2 through 4, the righteous sufferer is recalling how God wonderfully and miraculously saved the saints of old, and yet there he is suffering, and God is not rescuing him. And we see in verse 9 through 11, he's recalling how he's trusted in God, even from early childhood. The ideal sufferer, even from early childhood, is trusted in the Lord. And yet, the Lord hasn't come through yet. But still, he trusts in God, and he asks for God to save him. We see him continuing to suffer. And by verse 19, as his life is ebbing away, he cries out yet once again, Lord, come quickly to save me. They are just taking my life away. Deliver my life from them. So he's crying out for salvation as his life is being taken from him. And we see in the end of verse 21, finally, he is rescued. And verse 22 to 31 changes from a psalm of lament to a psalm of praise for God rescuing him and saving his life. But, wait a second, Jesus died. The martyrs died. That's why we call them martyrs. How did Jesus and how will these martyrs be rescued? Well, they're rescued because God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. And Jesus is the firstborn among many brothers. He's the firstborn from the dead. Just as God raised Jesus from the dead, so too he will raise up the martyrs. And he will raise us up as well if we die in faith. And so the martyr praises him in verse 24, because he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. He has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. God does not despise our affliction or abhor our affliction, especially when this is happening on account of our faith. In verse 26, he says, the afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Yes, they will, especially at the marriage supper of the Lamb. We will eat and we will be satisfied. We will know that the torment and torture that we may have had to endure, even perhaps physically, will be fully repaid. We will be fully satisfied. The Lord will fully satisfy us. Verse 27, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations shall worship. Jesus has a special blessing and a reward for those who are persecuted, especially even martyred for their faith. He said, your reward is great. 22 times he talked about rewards. Twice he talked about your reward being great when you love your enemies and when you are persecuted for the faith. And verse 28, for kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. He's going to make everything right. There's going to be a new earth. Everything's going to be made right for us. As Paul said, this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison.